Missouri, September 1944. When Martha Henderson first saw the small faces pressed against the fence of the temporary camp outside town, she didn't see enemy children. She saw hunger. The German families, displaced and waiting for processing, had been there for 3 weeks. Among them was 8-year-old Hans Müller, whose mother Anna clutched a faded photograph of their farm back in Bavaria. Little did they know that in this corner of rural America, they would discover something the war had nearly erased: the universal language of kindness between mothers. Before we continue, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here we retell the human stories forgotten by war. The Henderson farm stretched across rolling hills dotted with corn and apple orchards. For 3 generations, the family had worked this land, and Martha had learned from her mother that a full table was meant to be shared. When her husband James returned from town with news about the temporary camp, Martha's first thought wasn't about politics or enemies. It was about the children she'd glimpsed through the fence. "They're just families, James," she said, watching her own children play in the yard. Women and little ones, mostly. The mothers looked like they haven't eaten properly in months. The camp had been established hastily when a transport train carrying German civilians, families of military personnel and others deemed necessary for relocation, broke down just outside their small Missouri town. What was supposed to be a brief overnight stop had stretched into weeks as authorities sorted through paperwork and arranged continued transport. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's physician who served as liaison with the military authorities, had mentioned the dire conditions. Basic rations, but barely enough. And those children, he had shaken his head. Some of them haven't seen fresh fruit or vegetables in over a year. Martha made her decision that evening as she watched her daughter Mary help her gather the last of the season's apples. The trees were heavy with fruit, more than their family could possibly use. The vegetables in their garden were reaching peak harvest: corn, tomatoes, squash, and beans. It seemed almost sinful to let any of it go to waste when hungry children lived just 3 miles down the road. The next morning, Martha filled 2 large baskets with fresh apples, corn, and late summer vegetables. She convinced James to hitch up the wagon, though he worried about regulations and what the neighbors might think. "Martha, you know there are rules about contact with," he began. "With hungry children," she interrupted gently. "James Henderson, I've never known you to turn away from someone in need. These are babies and mothers, not soldiers." When they arrived at the camp, the military guard looked uncertain about the unusual delivery. Captain William Foster, a young officer from Kansas, examined the baskets with surprise. "Ma'am, this is very generous, but I need to check with—" "Captain," Martha said firmly, "I'm not asking to go inside or cause any trouble. I'm just offering food to children. Surely that can't be against any regulation that matters to a Christian nation." Through the fence, Anna Müller watched the exchange with disbelief. She had prepared herself and her son for the worst treatment from Americans. The propaganda back home had painted a picture of a ruthless enemy. But here was a farm woman with gentle eyes, arguing with a soldier about the right to feed German children. Captain Foster made a decision that would ripple through both communities. "I'll take responsibility," he said quietly, "but I supervise the distribution." As Martha's apples and vegetables were carried into the camp, something shifted in the atmosphere. Children who had been listless and withdrawn suddenly perked up at the sight of fresh food. Anna Müller bit into a crisp apple and closed her eyes, tasting sweetness she had almost forgotten existed. "Danke," she whispered through the fence to Martha, tears streaming down her face. Martha didn't speak German, but she understood perfectly. She nodded and smiled, then surprised everyone by saying, "I'll be back tomorrow." The next day, Martha returned with her neighbor, Ruth Collins, and 2 more baskets of produce. Word had spread quietly through their farming community, and by the end of the week, a small group of local women had formed what they called the Harvest Circle. Now, share with us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's amazing to see how far these human memories travel. Ruth brought her famous preserves and homemade bread. Sarah Williams contributed fresh milk and eggs from her dairy farm. Even old Mrs. Patterson, who rarely left her farm, sent along a jar of honey with a note that simply read, "For the children." Anna Müller had become the unofficial translator between the German families and their American benefactors. Her broken English, combined with Martha's patient gestures, created a bridge of understanding that transcended language barriers. "Mein Hans," Anna said, pointing to her son. He dreams of apples. Every night, apples." She mimed eating and smiled through tears. "You give him hope." Martha learned that Anna had been a farmer's wife in Bavaria, tending to her own garden and orchard before the war changed everything. The two women discovered they shared knowledge of preserving fruit, caring for chickens, and the endless worry that comes with raising children in uncertain times. Captain Foster found himself in an unusual position. Military protocol dictated strict limitations on civilian contact, but the humanitarian impact of the women's visits was undeniable. The children were healthier, the mothers more hopeful, and the entire atmosphere of the camp had improved dramatically. "These aren't prisoners of war," he wrote in his report to headquarters. "Their families caught in circumstances beyond their control. The local community's generosity has done more for morale and cooperation than any official directive could achieve." Dr. Morrison, who had been monitoring the health of the camp residents, noted remarkable improvements. "Proper nutrition and human kindness," he told Martha, "are proving to be the best medicine these people could receive." The breakthrough came when young Hans Müller shyly approached the fence during one of Martha's visits. In his hands, he held a small wooden horse that he had carved from a piece of scrap wood. "For your girl," he said in careful English, pointing to Martha's daughter Mary, who'd accompanied her mother that day. Mary looked to her mother, who nodded encouragingly. She accepted the gift and in return offered Hans one of her own treasured marbles, a bright blue one that caught the sunlight beautifully. "Schön," Hans whispered, holding the marble up to the light. "Beautiful." "Yes," Mary agreed, not knowing the German word, but understanding the sentiment perfectly. That evening, Anna Müller sat with several other German mothers, sharing the day's experiences. For the first time since leaving their homeland, they spoke of kindness received rather than hardships endured. "These Americans," said Greta Hoffmann, whose twin daughters had received dolls made from corn husks, "they are not what we were told to expect." Anna nodded, thinking of Martha's patient smile and the way she had gently corrected Hans's English pronunciation without making him feel embarrassed. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the war has lied to all of us about who our enemies really are." By October, what had started as individual acts of kindness had grown into something unprecedented. The local churches, led by Pastor David Matthews, organized what they called a harvest sharing festival, a carefully planned event that would allow greater interaction while respecting military protocols. The idea faced initial resistance from some community members who questioned the wisdom of fraternizing with the enemy. But the women of the Harvest Circle had allies in unexpected places. Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose own son was fighting in Europe, supported the initiative. "If showing Christian charity to hungry children makes us weak," he declared at a town meeting, "then I reckon we need more weakness in this world." Captain Foster, who had received clearance from his superiors after his positive reports, worked with Pastor Matthews to establish guidelines. The festival would take place in the field adjacent to the camp, with supervised interaction and shared activities that emphasized common humanity over political differences. Martha spent days organizing the event with military precision that would have impressed any general. She coordinated food donations, arranged for translators from the nearby German-speaking Mennonite community, and even convinced the local school to contribute artwork and music. On the day of the festival, Anna Müller helped Hans dress in his best remaining clothes, a shirt that was too small and patched trousers, but clean and carefully mended. She had spent the previous evening teaching him English phrases, "Thank you," "please," and "very nice." The transformation in the camp was visible as families prepared to participate in something that felt normal for the first time in months. Children who had been withdrawn and fearful showed excitement and curiosity about the promised festivities. When the gates opened and the German families walked into the field, they were greeted by tables laden with food that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Roasted corn, fresh bread, apple pies, pumpkin dishes, and more preserves than many had seen in years. Martha watched as Hans ran straight to Mary, showing her a new wooden carving, this time a small bird with outstretched wings. Mary had brought her collection of pressed autumn leaves, carefully arranged in a book her mother had helped her make. "Look," Mary said, opening the book to show Hans the brilliant red and gold leaves. "Autumn." "Herbst," Hans replied, teaching her the German word. He pointed to a particular leaf and said, "From my home, Bayern, Bavaria." Mary carefully removed one of her favorite leaves, a perfect maple leaf in deep crimson, and gave it to Hans. "For remember," she said in the simple English that children use naturally. Anna Müller found herself working alongside Martha and Ruth, serving food and discovering that laughter needed no translation. When Ruth's baby began crying, Anna instinctively reached out to comfort the child, her maternal instincts transcending any notion of nationality. "She's beautiful," Anna said, admiring the baby. "Mein Hans was so small once." She showed Martha a photograph from her purse, Hans as a toddler, standing in front of a farmhouse remarkably similar to Martha's own. The afternoon's highlight came when the local school children, led by their teacher, Miss Elizabeth Carson, performed a harvest song. The German children listened carefully, and then Anna Müller began singing a traditional Bavarian harvest song. Other German mothers joined in, their voices carrying across the field, in harmonies that spoke of shared human experiences, gratitude for the earth's bounty, hope for the future, and the universal desire to provide for one's children. As the sun began to set, no one wanted the day to end. Plans were made for weekly gatherings, weather permitting. Captain Foster, who had initially worried about maintaining proper military distance, found himself deeply moved by what he had witnessed. "Sir," he wrote in his evening report, "today I observed something that I believe represents the best of American values. Our citizens demonstrated that strength and security come not from fear and isolation, but from the confidence to extend humanity even to those designated as enemies." That night, Hans Müller fell asleep clutching Mary's maple leaf and the blue marble, while across town, Mary carefully placed Hans's wooden bird on her bedroom windowsill where it would catch the morning sun. November brought the first snow, and the sobering news that the German families would be relocated to a permanent facility in Texas before Christmas. The announcement hit both communities hard, but it also galvanized them into making the remaining weeks as meaningful as possible. Martha organized what became known as the Winter Preparation Project. Understanding that the families would face harsh conditions in their next location, the farming community worked together to provide practical supplies, warm clothing, preserved foods, and basic necessities that could be transported. If this story has touched you, please leave a like. It helps Hans's story reach more people and reminds us what the war tried to erase: our shared humanity. Anna Müller had become an integral part of the local community in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Her knowledge of traditional German preserving techniques helped the local women extend their harvest preservation efforts. In return, she learned American methods for making winter comfort foods. "In Bavaria," she told Martha while they worked together in the church kitchen, "we make Apfelkuchen, apple cake, when first snow comes. Is tradition for, how you say, thankful?" "Thanksgiving," Martha replied, smiling. "We have that tradition too, just in different ways." The idea emerged naturally, a combined Thanksgiving celebration that would honor both American and German traditions of gratitude for harvest and community. Pastor Matthews supported the idea enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate Christian values of fellowship and reconciliation. Preparations became a true collaboration. Anna taught Martha's daughter Mary how to make simple German Christmas decorations from paper and natural materials. In return, Mary showed Hans how to string popcorn and cranberries for Christmas garlands, a tradition that delighted him. The project took on deeper meaning when Anna revealed that she had been saving small amounts of flour and sugar to attempt baking something special for Christmas. For Hans, she said quietly, to remember home, but also to remember here. This place where people were kind. Martha was deeply moved. Here was a woman who had every reason to be bitter and fearful, instead choosing to create moments of joy for her child and preserve memories of unexpected kindness. The combined Thanksgiving celebration took place on a crisp November day that felt like nature's blessing on their efforts. The field was decorated with both American autumn displays and traditional German harvest symbols that Anna and the other mothers had created. The menu reflected their blended traditions: turkey and stuffing alongside sauerbraten and spätzle, cranberry sauce next to red cabbage, pumpkin pie sharing table space with apfelstrudel. Children who had been strangers months earlier now played together with the easy friendship that transcends adult complications. Hans had become quite proficient in English, serving as a translator for younger German children and proudly showing off his American friends to visiting relatives within the camp. His wooden carvings had evolved, too. He now created pieces that combined German folk art traditions with American motifs he had learned from Mary and her family. During the celebration, Anna Möller stood to address the gathering in her improving English. In Germany, we learn America is enemy, but here we find family. Martha, Ruth, Sarah, you show us kindness when we expect only hardness. You feed our children when your own sons fight our country. This is—" she paused, searching for words. "This is God's love, yes?" The crowd was silent, moved by her simple eloquence. Then Martha stood and embraced Anna, followed by Ruth, Sarah, and others. What had begun as a charitable gesture had evolved into genuine community and friendship. That evening, as families prepared to return to their respective homes, Hans approached Martha with his most ambitious carving yet, a small nativity scene featuring figures that looked remarkably like the people he had come to know in Missouri. Mary as the angel, Martha as Mary, and even Captain Foster as one of the wise men. "For remember," he said, using Mary's phrase from months earlier, "for remember friends." December arrived with bitter cold and the final preparations for the family's transfer to Texas. What no one anticipated was how profoundly these few months had changed everyone involved. German families, American farmers, and even military personnel who had witnessed something extraordinary. Martha spent the last weeks working frantically to prepare care packages that would travel with each family. These weren't just supplies. They were carefully chosen items that would carry memories and provide comfort in an uncertain future. Family recipes written out in both English and German, photographs of their time together, preserved foods that would remind them of the Missouri harvest, and handmade items created specifically for each family. Subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share in the comments which part touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy. Anna Möller had been working on her own farewell project. Using fabric scraps donated by the local quilting circle, she had created a memory quilt that depicted scenes from their time in Missouri. The harvest festival, children playing together, women working side by side in the church kitchen, and the shared Thanksgiving celebration. "For Hans," she explained to Martha, "so he never forgets that enemies can become family." The departure day, December 18th, dawned grey and cold. The entire community turned out despite the weather, creating a scene that Captain Foster would describe in his final report as one of the most moving displays of human decency I have witnessed in my military career. Hans Müller, now confidently bilingual, served as spokesman for the German children. Standing on a wooden crate so everyone could see him, he delivered a speech that Martha had helped him write, but that came entirely from his heart. American friends, you give us food when we are hungry. You give us warmth when we are cold. But most important, you give us hope when we forget how to hope. Hans from Bavaria says thank you. All children say thank you. We never forget Missouri kindness. The gifts exchanged that day would be treasured for lifetimes. Mary gave Hans her most precious possession, a locket containing a photograph of both their families together. Hans presented Mary with a wooden music box he had carved, featuring dancing figurines that represented their friendship. Martha and Anna's farewell was particularly emotional. These two farm women, who had bridged languages and cultures through shared motherhood and common humanity, had formed a bond that transcended the circumstances that brought them together. "Promise me," Martha said, pressing a final package into Anna's hands. "Promise me you'll write. I need to know that Hans grows up well and remembers that he has family in Missouri." Anna, tears flowing freely, nodded. "I promise. And you promise to remember that German mother can love American children too, that war does not change heart of woman who loves children." As the transport vehicles pulled away, the German families pressed their faces to the windows, waving until they could no longer see the group of Americans who had changed their understanding of what was possible between supposed enemies. The impact of those months rippled forward in ways no one could have predicted. Captain Foster's detailed reports influenced military policy regarding civilian displaced persons. The success of the Missouri model was studied and replicated at other temporary camps across the United States. Years later, when Hans Müller had grown up and become a successful businessman in Texas, he would establish a foundation dedicated to helping refugee children, inspired by the kindness he received as an 8-year-old boy from American farmers who chose to see hunger instead of nationality. Martha Henderson continued to receive letters from Anna for over 30 years. The correspondence, carefully preserved by Martha's family, documented Hans's education, his marriage, and the birth of his own children. Grandchildren who would grow up hearing stories about the Missouri farm family who showed their grandfather that kindness was stronger than war. In 1974, 30 years after that first harvest sharing, Hans Müller returned to Missouri with his own son. He found Martha, now elderly but still living on the family farm. The reunion was covered by local newspapers, but for Martha and Hans, it was simply a promise fulfilled. Proof that seeds of kindness, planted in the darkest times, could grow into forests of hope. The wooden bird Hans had carved for Mary still sat on her windowsill, now joined by dozens of other gifts he had sent over the years. The blue marble Mary had given him was mounted in a place of honor in his Texas home, where his own children learned the story of how enemies became family through the simple act of sharing a harvest. As Hans's son played in the same fields where his father and Mary had once collected leaves together, the circle of understanding completed itself. The harvest those Missouri farmers had shared wasn't just food. It was faith in humanity's capacity to choose love over fear, compassion over hatred, and hope over despair. In a world torn apart by war, a small group of American farmers had discovered something profound. The most powerful weapon against hatred is a mother's instinct to feed hungry children, regardless of what flag they were born under. And sometimes, that simple act of humanity can echo through generations, creating ripples of peace that outlast any conflict. 25 years after the last transport truck disappeared down the dusty Missouri road, the ripple effects of that extraordinary autumn continued to spread in ways both profound and unexpected. The story of the Harvest Circle had become more than local legend. It had quietly influenced policy, inspired similar acts of compassion, and created bonds that would span continents and decades. By 1969, Hans Müller had established the Missouri Kindness Foundation from his successful construction business in Dallas, Texas. The foundation specifically focused on providing educational opportunities for refugee children entering the United States, regardless of their country of origin. In his mission statement, Hans wrote, "An 8-year-old boy once received an apple from an American farmer's wife. That apple contained more than nutrition. It held hope, dignity, and the promise that enemies could become family. Every scholarship we provide carries the seeds of that same transformation." Martha Henderson, now 73 and a grandmother of 12, had become an unlikely advocate for refugee assistance programs. Her testimony before Congress in 1965, during debates about expanding refugee admissions, included a simple but powerful statement. "I fed hungry German children in 1944 because they were children first, German second. Today's refugee children deserve the same consideration, to be seen as children first, regardless of the politics that displaced them." The correspondence between Martha and Anna Müller had evolved into a bridge between communities. Anna's letters, translated by Hans and shared with Martha's permission, were published in the Lutheran Messenger and later compiled into a small book titled Letters from the Heart, a German mother's gratitude to American farmers. The modest publication sold over 50,000 copies, with all proceeds donated to international children's relief organizations. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome was the influence on military policy regarding civilian displaced persons. Captain William Foster, who had supervised those first tentative meetings between American farmers and German families, had risen to the rank of colonel and served as an advisor on refugee affairs to the Pentagon. His detailed reports from Missouri had become required reading at military academies, illustrating how humanitarian approaches could enhance security rather than compromise it. The Missouri model, as it came to be known in military circles, demonstrated that treating displaced civilians with dignity and allowing supervised community interaction created more stable, cooperative conditions than isolation and suspicion. The model influenced American approaches to civilian populations in subsequent conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam. Mary Henderson, now a social worker specializing in refugee resettlement, credited her childhood experience with Hans Müller as the defining influence on her career choice. "When you're 7 years old and you make friends with someone who speaks a different language, you learn that friendship transcends borders," she reflected in a 1970 interview. "Hans taught me that the things that matter most, kindness, curiosity, the desire to play and learn, are universal human qualities." The wooden bird Hans had carved for Mary remained on her windowsill throughout her childhood, through college, marriage, and motherhood. When her own daughter asked about the small, weathered carving, Mary would tell the story of the German boy who became her first lesson in understanding that the world was both larger and smaller than she had imagined. In Germany, Anna Müller had become a voice for reconciliation within her own community. Her accounts of American kindness during the family's displacement challenged persistent narratives about American brutality toward German civilians. Speaking at church gatherings and women's circles, she would say, "I cannot speak for all Germans or all Americans, but I can speak for this. There exist people in every nation who choose kindness over fear, and those people are our true hope for peace." The Harvest Festival tradition had taken root in unexpected ways. The United Lutheran Church of Missouri began hosting annual international friendship harvests that brought together refugees from various conflicts with local farming communities. By 1970, the tradition had spread to 17 states and had facilitated the integration of thousands of displaced families into American communities. Dr. Samuel Morrison, The town physician who had first alerted Martha to conditions in the German camp documented the long-term health outcomes of the families who had participated in the Harvest Circle program. His research, published in the Journal of Public Health in 1968, showed significantly better psychological adjustment and physical health outcomes among German displaced persons who had experienced positive community integration during their displacement, compared to those who had remained isolated in institutional settings. The research contributed to growing understanding about the importance of community support in refugee resettlement and influenced the development of what would later become formal sponsor programs for refugee families. Morrison's work demonstrated that Martha Henderson's instinctive understanding that healing required not just food but human connection had been scientifically sound. Ruth Collins, Martha's neighbor and co-founder of the Harvest Circle, had kept meticulous records of the food donations, volunteer hours, and community involvement in their informal program. Her documentation became valuable historical evidence for scholars studying civilian responses to wartime displacement. The University of Missouri acquired her papers in 1967, and they became part of a growing archive documenting American homefront activities during World War II. By the 1970s, Hans Müller's children were regular visitors to Missouri, spending summers with Martha Henderson's extended family. The language barrier that had once seemed insurmountable was bridged by the second generation, who grew up bilingual in English and German, and served as translators not just of words, but of cultural understanding. The most poignant continuation of the story came in 1974, when Hans Müller's teenage son, Peter, chose to write his high school senior project about the experience his father had described to him throughout his childhood. Peter interviewed Martha Henderson, now 78, along with surviving members of the original Harvest Circle and several of the German families who had been at the Missouri camp. His project, titled "When Enemies Planted Seeds of Peace," won state and national recognition and was later expanded into a documentary film that premiered in both the United States and Germany. The film's message, that ordinary citizens could choose compassion over hostility, even during wartime, resonated with audiences still grappling with the divisions created by ongoing conflicts in Southeast Asia. Martha Henderson's final letter to Anna Müller, written just before Anna's death in 1976, captured the lasting significance of their unlikely friendship. "My dear Anna, when I first saw your son's hungry face through that fence, I never imagined we were planting seeds for a forest of understanding that would grow for generations. Hans has become the son I never had, and his children are teaching my grandchildren that the world is full of family we simply haven't met yet. Thank you for trusting a Missouri farm woman with your precious boy. Together, we proved that love is always stronger than fear." The legacy lived on in countless small ways. In the refugee families who found welcome in American communities because precedents for kindness had been established. In the military personnel who approached civilian populations with greater humanity because they had been trained in the Missouri model. In the children and grandchildren who grew up understanding that enemies were often simply people whose stories they hadn't yet heard. When Hans Müller died in 1995, his funeral was attended by representatives from 3 countries and 4 generations of the extended family that had begun with a Missouri farm woman's decision to share her harvest with hungry German children. The wooden bird he had carved for Mary Henderson, now cracked with age, was buried with him, a symbol of the flight from enmity to understanding that had defined his remarkable life. Martha Henderson's gravestone, when she passed in 1982 at age 86, bore a simple inscription chosen by her family. She fed the hungry and found that kindness multiplies. Below it, in smaller text, was a line translated from one of Anna Müller's letters. "Liebe überwindet alles. Love conquers all." The story that began with surplus apples and hungry children had evolved into something far greater. Proof that in the darkest chapters of human history, ordinary people could still choose to write verses of hope, compassion, and reconciliation that would echo long after the conflicts that created them had faded into memory.